You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 19th of February 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Termack. Coming up on today's program, Donald Trump's latest round of tariffs on cars impact a friend in Japan. We'll look at how the Asian nation might circumvent them. After that,
I don't think we're even talking about leadership. It's just that Germany, a country of its size, needs to live up to its promises, to its allies, and to promises that were made already back in 2014.
The latest installment of our German elections series looks at defense, security, and the once pacifist Greens Party. We'll also explore the world of aviation safety, and after that, Monocle's Grace Charlton, you have a new fashion house unveiling in Shanghai.
Yes, Loewe is hoping to strike gold.
With a gold cube. And finally, our own editor-in-chief, Andrew Tuck, is here to talk about whether cyclists should be taxed for using our roads. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Termack. Tariffs have been the name of the game for U.S. President Donald Trump since entering office, and yesterday he announced that his next focus will be foreign cars. The U.S. president said he could impose a 25% tariff on foreign car imports as early as April, and the news will come as something of a surprise to Japan, which had hoped to escape some of the harsher tariff policies of the Trump administration after a successful meeting between the president and Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba earlier this month. Well, I'm joined now from Tokyo by Peter Landers, Asia Business and Finance Editor at The Wall Street Journal. Peter, great to have you on the show. Let's start with what we know, because this is always a bit unclear about these latest rounds of tariffs.
Yes, it's just something that Trump mentioned, that he thinks the car tariffs will be about 25%. As you said, they could take effect in April. But like so many of Trump's announcements, it's hard to know how seriously to take this and whether he'll really go through with it. And we recall, I mean, it's only been a month since Trump became president, but we've already had a case where he announced 25% tariffs on all goods coming from Canada and Mexico and then reversed himself. Those have not been completely eliminated. The possibility remains, but it's still a possibility at this point. And I think the same goes for the car tariffs. Japan, as you said, hoped that the meeting with President Trump and Prime Minister Ishiba would prevent tariffs. And I think they still hope that somehow they can be avoided.
And how are they going to go about maybe trying to avoid that? Tell us how this news is going down in Japan and whether car makers are also reacting. Is there anything they can do?
If the tariffs are truly implemented as Trump described them, there are a bunch of bad options. Of course, you can raise prices. You can simply charge American consumers more and continue to export cars from places like Japan, or they have factories in Mexico and Canada. Export those to the United States, as you always do, and simply charge American consumers more. You can try to increase production at your U.S. factories, and all of the major Japanese automakers like Toyota, Nissan, Honda, they have factories in the U.S. and many of the cars they sell there are American made. You can try to increase that number, but you can't do so overnight. You can't completely change your global footprint just because Trump said something one day or imposed a tariff 1 month that could be reversed the next month.
And is there a way that you imagine Japan could escape this? Could it get some kind of exemption? That is something that Japan's foreign minister specifically asked for in his own meeting with Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State.
That's right. Japan has already asked for an exemption on steel tariffs and aluminum tariffs. That's a much smaller portion of Japan's exports, but I think that precedent would hold for cars as well. And Japan would say we're a close ally of the U.S. We already manufacture many cars in the U.S., so it's not as if we haven't invested there, tens of billions of dollars. And they would say, as an ally, can we get an exemption? And I'm sure other allies will ask for the same thing.
And Peter, I mean, as a business and finance editor, when you try and look at this objectively, I'm just curious if you could describe what Japan has done, because as you say, a lot of Japanese automakers do have plants in the United States. They have invested pretty heavily in the United States. Is there are they being unfair here? Are they still, spending too much money abroad, or is there really a case that compared to other countries, Japan has actually done quite a lot to boost American manufacturing?
I think they would make that case, and I guess you could argue from the U.S. perspective, if it's not 100%, if every single car sold in the United States is not made in America, then there's still a problem. That's an argument that someone could make. But I think the Japanese would say, well, you never told us that. You told us to invest a lot. We did. Most of the cars that are sold to Americans are made by our factories in the U.S., and isn't that enough? And the other thing they would say is, under the first Trump administration, the former NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, was revised to the U.S., Mexico, Canada Free Trade Agreement. And so a lot of Japanese companies have invested in North America, especially in Mexico, and they build their cars there and export them across the border under the terms of that free trade deal that was adopted in the first Trump administration. So they would say, we've tried to adapt to your policies, Mr. President, and that's why we moved to Mexico, in some cases from Japan, to a neighboring country. We built a North American supply chain like you seem to want in that first agreement. So please don't reverse course in your second term.
And Peter, when it comes to Japan's diplomacy, as we mentioned, this meeting between the Prime Minister, Shigeru Ishiba, and Trump, they will have hoped for a different result from that. Do you expect any kind of heat to fall on Ishiba as a result of that? Are Japanese companies going to say, hey, you were there, we expected a different result from this?
I think most people in Japan understand that he's in a difficult position. And I should add that Trump did not single out Japan in his remarks this week about 25% tariffs. He just said it would be on all imported cars. And he didn't criticize Japan specifically. After the meeting with Ishiba, he said he thought Ishiba was a strong prime minister, which is actually a little bit different from the political analysis that people would make here in Tokyo. So I think they hit it off pretty well, and they maybe started a relationship that would allow Ishiba to say to Trump, when these car tariffs get closer, can we get an exemption? So I don't think there's too much criticism yet. If it really happens and Japan can't get any dispensation at all, then the criticism might start to increase.
And just quickly, Peter, as you said, Japan was not necessarily the focus. How is this going down in the rest of Asia? How much of an impact do you expect it to have there?
I think there's fear, throughout Asia, and I'm based in Singapore, just visiting Tokyo this week. But just that the entire trading system that's built up over the past few decades, really centered around China as well, would fall apart under the Trump administration, but it has not yet. His 10% tariffs on Chinese goods definitely were taken seriously by China, and China retaliated, but it's a lot less than some of the more extreme tariffs that Trump has talked about in the past. So I think there's certainly a lot of apprehension that 10% tariff on Chinese goods could go up to 50, 60, 100, or who knows what.
Thanks very much, Peter. That was Peter Landers of the Wall Street Journal in Tokyo and Singapore. Now here's Carlotta Rebello with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky accused U.S. President Donald Trump of living in a disinformation space after the Trump administration said it would push for fresh elections in Ukraine. Zelensky said he was surprised Ukrainians were not invited to the U.S.-Russia meetings in Saudi Arabia on Tuesday and called for an allied position between the U.S. and Europe on the war. Brazil's chief prosecutor has unveiled charges against former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro and 33 others for plotting a coup in 2022 and conspiring to kill rivals, including current President Lula da Silva. The Supreme Court will now have to decide whether the charges can move forward. And Lego is opening a new 1.2 billion euros manufacturing plant in southern Vietnam this April. The 44.8 hectare factory will be the Danish toymaker group's first carbon-neutral facility and its largest overseas investment project. You can read more about it by heading over to monocle.com/minute. Those are today's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Carlotta. And it's time now for the latest installment of our German election series running through this week. Today we look at the Greens, a once pacifist anti-war party that has become among the most strident voices on Ukraine, leading a broader shift in how Germany thinks about defense and security. Monocle's Julia Lasica reports.
My name is Hanna Neumann. I'm the spokesperson for foreign policy for the Greens in the European Parliament.
For Hanna Neumann of the Greens, a party that was once known as pacifist, there has been a consistency in its approach to conflict over the past 40 years. It has always been focused on a respect for international law, justice and peace.
In the 80s and 90s, this meant criticizing NATO. In the 90s, this also meant criticizing, for example, some invasions of the US in Iraq and others. But things have fundamentally changed with Putin's attack on Ukraine.
For Neumann, while the war in Ukraine has pushed the Greens into becoming advocates for defence and security, Ukraine's fight is also directly linked to the party's founding principles.
Ukraine is the only country that has ever agreed to giving up on nuclear weapons in return for security guarantees from both Russia and NATO. And I mean, if we ever want to discuss demilitarization again and trust international rules, again, this will only be possible if bullies don't get away with it.
When Germany's Green Party was first established in 1980 in the city of Karlsruhe, its founding members formulated the party's ideology in 4 pillars: social justice, ecological wisdom, grassroots democracy, and non-violence. More than 4 decades on, and the current German cabinet's leading Greens, Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock and Vice Chancellor Robert Habeck, are defence and security hawks. So, what happened? And what does it reveal about Germany's more general attitudes to defence and security?
In a sense, the Greens were never a wholly pacifist party. There were different strands to it. And they were also a very cosmopolitan party, a very internationalist party. So support for international law, for multilateralism, for a rule-based international order was always very important for the Greens.
Christoph Meyer is Professor of European and International Politics at King's College London. He pinpoints the war in Yugoslavia in the 1990s as the turning point for the Green Party, a lesson after much of Europe stood by as atrocities took place.
That, in a sense, prepared the ground for saying, look, if human rights are important, if you don't want to see ethnic cleansing and genocide perpetrated on European soil again, you can't, something has to give. So you can't just wait for some sort of courts in 10 years' time to do something. You need to be able to prevent or stop that violence.
For the Green Party today, the lessons of Kosovo remain relevant and feed into their understanding of Germany's current defence policy, specifically regarding Ukraine. Neumann says the current debate within Germany also goes beyond security and defence, to the heart of what it means to be a pacifist.
The question is, what do you mean by pacifism? Do you mean by pacifism, I'm not going to defend myself against the most brutal of all aggressions and I just close my eyes and watch others being violated terribly? Just remember the pictures from Bucha, for example. Or do you mean by pacifism that our goal is to build a world where we deal with our conflicts with words and where we all uphold the same rules and commit to them so that it's no longer needed to have weapons? Well, if it's the latter, I would still describe myself as a pacifist. If it's the earlier, I don't think it's a smart thing to do.
The Green Party's push for Ukrainian defence has tied in with a larger German push for stronger military security. In 2022, Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced a €100 billion special fund to modernise the German military. But many, including the Greens and the Ukrainians, say this hasn't gone far enough.
Chancellor Scholz actually said that there's going to be this Zeitenwende, this major change in Germany's policy. But unfortunately, much of that remained more of a statement of rhetoric exercise, even though Germany did address some of the concerns, but not enough, clearly not enough.
This is Volodymyr Dubowik, an associate professor at the Department of International Relations at the University of Odessa-Mechnikov and senior fellow at the Centre for European Policy Analysis. He says Germany's armed forces remain ill-equipped 3 years after promises of investment. And for Ukrainians, Germany should take on the role of Europe's leader, despite the crippling legacy the country left behind after occupying Ukraine during the Second World War.
We understand the historic problems that maybe Germans have, the mental barriers in terms of playing more active role, specifically in the military affairs. But those hesitations need to be overcome because it's a different Germany now, and Germany should play a bigger role.
For Dubovik, the main aim is for the Greens, as the biggest proponents of Ukraine, to stay the course.
Those values which push them to support Ukraine when they understand that what Russia is doing towards Ukraine is just plain wrong, and therefore the Russian aggression should not remain unanswered. And support of Ukraine is a morally right thing to do, but also in terms of overall European security.
For Christoph Meyer of King's College London, this goes beyond just leading.
I don't think we're even talking about leadership. It's just that Germany, a country of its size, needs to live up to its promises, to its allies, and promises that were made already back in 2014.
So what next for the election? Neumann of the Greens says her party will keep pushing for their existing goals, such as handing over Germany's long-range Taurus missiles to Ukraine and boosting Europe's own defence.
We have to invest in defence, not because we like weapons or because we want to make the arms industry rich, but because the world is what it is and because we have this Russian aggression on one side. And this really isn't helping this weird guy in the White House where you never know what you wake up with in the news. It would be naive not to also prepare for a situation where Trump either withdraws from NATO or he tries to really attack members of NATO, such as he was announcing he would annex Canada. So it would be naive not to at least anticipate and where really necessary, also prepare for a situation where we cannot rely any longer on US as our security partner.
In other words, for the Greens, boosting European security is now a necessity for peace. For Monocle Radio, I'm Julia Lassica.
Julia Lassica, thank you very much for that report. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing. I'm Chris Chermak. To aviation now, where a series of accidents in North America, coupled with some plans for staff cuts at the Federal Aviation Administration as part of a wider White House government shakeup, is all making waves in the industry. The latest accident was a Delta Airlines jet that crashed and overturned on landing in Toronto on Monday, prompting some questions about how to keep up passenger faith in what, it must be said, does remain the safest way to travel. Well, I'm joined now by Paul Charles, founder and CEO of luxury travel and trade consultancy, the PC Agency, and the former director of Virgin Atlantic and Eurostar. Paul, great to have you back on the show. What have your impressions been of these recent accidents we've been seeing?
It's undoubtedly a more challenging environment for the aviation sector. More of us are flying, more aircraft are in the skies than ever before, even before COVID and that period when, of course, many aircraft weren't flying. And the accidents we've seen more recently, sadly, have taken on a grim toll, and we've seen more casualties. So to those of us who are regulars in the skies, it might seem a little more challenging. It might seem that they're more wary of flying. But actually, flying is still a very safe industry compared, for example, to traveling by road.
Well, it absolutely is. And that does bring me to the question, Paul, about what the aviation sector does in delicate moments like this. How does the industry typically deal with this? Because investigations can take a while, but you don't want to shake public confidence.
Exactly. It's a very, very good question. And actually, there are two T's that are paramount here. The first T is trust. The second is training. So dealing with trust, airlines and airports and the whole sector has to build trust. It has to show how safe pilots, how well they're trained, how well they can cope with unforeseen incidents, and the cabin crew as well. And some of the best airlines in the world, like Air New Zealand, for example, or Hawaiian Airlines, which consistently rate very highly in terms of safety. They build trust extremely well by really zoning in on safety throughout the journey that you're on with them. And the second is training, as I say, and the best airlines really put more money and development into their training regimes. And in fact, what you saw with Delta, with the crash just a few days ago, was superb training in action by the crew. Everybody was wearing their seatbelt, and that's why nobody, thankfully, died in that incident.
There is another aspect of this, Paul, that is not about the airlines, but the aviation sector. Air traffic controllers, that's something that's also been somewhat under scrutiny, both for example, the crash in Washington, D.C., and just the sheer amount of planes in the sky around Reagan Airport, but then also with right now the Federal Aviation Administration potentially losing staff. That's certainly not a good look at the moment, is it, when we are dealing with a certain amount of accidents?
Yes, the Trump administration is clearly making waves in terms of reducing the workforce at a time when the skies are getting more crowded. And it does seem at odds with the notion of wanting more expertise in air traffic control. Clearly, there is a balancing act going on between the Trump administration's desire to reduce costs across the administration and that need to have more expertise. The Trump administration say they're reducing numbers who are less experienced, who are new to the industry, and they want the best trained, which is admirable. But of course, you do need more people in air traffic control to be the eyes and ears on the ground to prevent such accidents as we've seen recently. I think there's a wider issue globally, not just in the US, around air traffic control as a whole. The systems were designed decades ago. They're not as fit for purpose as they should be for skies which are busier and for more turbulent weather and climate change. And you need air traffic controls to be fit for purpose now. They need to be overhauled. There's no doubt about it. But that doesn't mean reducing numbers. It means actually increasing the expertise within those ATCs.
Paul Charles of the PC Agency, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. The Spanish luxury brand Casa Loewe has unveiled its largest flagship store in Asia, in Shanghai, also marking its first foray into the Chinese financial capital, but not the first foray into Shanghai for fashion houses in general. And for more now, I'm joined right here in the studio by Grace Charlton, Monocle's associate editor. Good afternoon, Grace.
Hi, Chris.
You described this as gold coming to Shanghai. Let's start with that. Describe this particular flagship for us.
I think, it deserves a bit of description because it's visually super stunning. The exterior features over 35,000 golden tiles that are meant to glitter and refract sunlight. They're all handmade in Barcelona as well. They were flown to Shanghai to do no expense was spared.
No expense spared there, absolutely.
And that's just the exterior. And then the interior, I think it's about 4 stories. They've got these sort of meadows and prairies and the window displays with little flowers. They've got art collections. They've got a design collection. I think I saw a George Nakashima armchair in there somewhere. So it's got all the fingerprints, I guess, of Jonathan Anderson, who's the creative director of Loewe, still for now, although there are rumors that he might leave, but that's a different discussion. It's pretty impressive.
Tell me about this intersection of design and fashion. What does it say about, a brand like Casa Loewe leaning into not just the fashion side, but really designing a space that stands out? Yeah,
it's sort of the artification or the designification of the fashion world. It's really interesting. Shops can't just be clothes on rails now. They have to provide a sort of gallery experience. It's all part of the storytelling of the house and the intellectualizing it, I guess, to justify the prices of the clothes and the accessories on some level as well. At my most cynical, it's a little bit of a marketing technique as well.
A marketing technique, but you do want to keep people in stores, and that's clearly a part about it. Tell me also about the market in Shanghai itself. What do you make of the fact that they are launching this big flagship there?
It's a clear angling for the Chinese market. There have been lots of whispers and concerns in the fashion industry, or it's been confirmed as well, but there is a downturn in the Chinese luxury market. I was at Pitti earlier this year, the big menswear fair in Florence, and everyone was saying like the Chinese buyers were just not present this time around. So I think there's, the Chinese market was sort of this gold mine for the luxury industry for the longest time. And they thought they could just come in and rely on their historical cachet and do the occasional red Lunar New Year collection, and that would sort of boost sales. But I think they're now realizing they need to show more effort and, do things like have incredible flagships in Shanghai really helps.
Show more effort, but we've also seen some others like Gucci actually pull back from Shanghai. Do you think Loewe can sort of stand the test of time with its gold cube?
I reckon it is. And, Shanghai is a city that really prizes its malls, and the architecture of the shops is super impressive. So I think it is a good strategy from Loewe. Can't give up.
Is there, just finally, Grace, is there a greater focus on Asia in general, do you feel, from fashion houses right now?
I actually don't, just instinctively compared to a few years ago. So it'll be interesting to see in the next coming quarters, if you will, how they try to pull it back a little bit, or pull the Chinese market back towards them.
Grace Charlton, Monocle's associate editor, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And finally, on today's briefing, the Swiss city of Zürich is about to take cyclists to task by pushing them to pay traffic taxes and fees, basically just like any other mode of transport on the roads. The idea is that cyclists should help pay for road maintenance and other traffic infrastructure. And joining me now is Monocle's editor-in-chief and host of The Urbanist, Andrew Tuck. Good afternoon, Andrew.
Good afternoon. I would just say, hold on to your cycle helmet a moment, because when we say is about to, I think it's come up.
It's considerate.
It's considerate.
Maybe I was leaning into a little too strong.
You ratcheted up into fifth gear there, when we should be just pootling along on first gear first. We haven't got up the hill yet, Chris.
I have, but I am a cyclist, so this does, I'm very sensitive to something like this. I mean, Howard, how do you feel about even if they're just considering it?
Well, here's the debate. So the notion is being put forward that cyclists demand lots of infrastructure. They want new cycle lanes. They're very expensive to implement, especially in somewhere like Switzerland. It's, I think, some 500,000 Swiss francs per kilometre. They also then wear down those cycle lanes, and they need to be repaired and looked after, and there's signage and all the things. So why shouldn't they pay the kind of road tax that car users pay? Well, here's the rub in that argument, because surely all cities are trying to get people off of cars, out of their cars, and being a bit more environmental, not polluting the air. So as soon as you start taxing people for using their bicycles, they're going to say, hey, well, if I'm paying for the bicycle as well, I might as well take the car, even if it's less. So I don't think that in the end cities are going to find this very appealing. And also, if you go through the logic of it, then it's surely then people who are walking on pavements, they demand pavements, and they're big, heavy
pavements get cracks,
and people with big feet, maybe they should be paying more for walking on the pavements than children. So you begin to see that it becomes a little bit illogical. I understand probably that there's one or two people who are car drivers who think, oh, this is unfair. Why am I being charged for all these taxes? The other thing to notice is that many of the Swiss parties involved in both in the canton and in the city, they're not exactly pro-tax. So the idea of bringing in another tax may also kind of give this idea a bit of a flat tire, as it were.
I did wonder, though, at the same time, is there some positive to this, just in the idea that we're maturing when it comes to cycling? I mean, there was a point where, as you say, it was sort of always trying to force people to use bikes instead of cars. Is this maybe a sign that the discussion's changing a little bit? Cyclists are established. They're not necessarily going to change their routine just because they have to pay a little bit of a fee.
Well, look, I think in somewhere like Zurich, cycling is very popular, and people who are wedded to it are not going to back off. We talked to a company called Freitag when we did our quality of life survey in Istanbul, an amazing company based in Zurich. They became famous for their bags, but they're now making a kind of a Swiss version of the cargo bike. And they said that actually young people are pretty cool about using it because they've made a funky kind of cargo bike, using them for all sorts of things, for doing their shopping, for transporting their kids around. I don't think I would like to pay tax. There's a few things in London. So, for example, you see these big bicycles where I saw some of them yesterday where they do have an engine on. They're essentially a motorbike. So in those instances, then surely those people should be being stopped. There's a lot of rule breaking, as we all know, for cyclists. People jump lights, people are not taking care, people cycling on the pavements, threatening some people with their behaviour. And I think we need some control. It shouldn't be that cyclists are free of all restrictions and codes of conduct. But I don't think this is the answer.
I don't have an electric big motor or violate too many traffic laws, so I'm hoping that I might be exempt from all of that.
Well, I hope so. Are you a Lycra man?
I am not a Lycra man. No,
okay.
No, I am not a Lycra man. Maybe that's the next step.
You're not breaking that.
That's a whole other segment.
You're not breaking that rule either. I mean on your bicycle rather than at home as well, by the way.
Andrew Tuck, thank you very much for joining us. That's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Laura Kramer and Tom Webb. Our researcher was Maisie Ringer and our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield, with editing assistance by Lily Austin. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.